Katie. She's wonderful. Katie.
So in our first class, we kind of gave an introduction to the 12 steps. Just for context, for those that weren't here in the first class, I myself am not in recovery. So what qualifies me to speak about this topic? Well, first of all, as it says in the introduction of the 12 and 12, the 12 steps is really a spiritual path for anybody who's looking for a spiritual path. My whole life, I grew up on a spiritual path. The teachings of Chabad philosophy are this, I don't want to say this and more, because this is a whole world, but the teachings that I grew up on are fundamentally these principles, the 12-step principles. They manifest themselves in their own way, but I've always found common language. And without getting into the whole story, I became passionate about recovery about 5 years ago when a young man who was attending our Chabad passed away from an overdose. And really through Jeff's place, which is named in his memory, and in the last year with Bridget's amazing work, we've been able to really expand what we're doing. And really our objective is to help minimize stigma. That addiction is not a moral failing, it's a disease, and to empower more people to find the path of recovery, which within the 12 steps is specifically a spiritual path, a relationship with a higher power. And these are the tools and the steps to making that happen. So that's my qualifications. So we addressed the first 3 steps last time, and we're gonna try to get from 4 to 8. We'll see how we do. So step number 4, made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. So why the need for this inventory? So I'm going to touch on this idea a couple of times today. There's an underlying, today is actually an interesting day on the Chabad calendar. If you're not familiar with Chabad, so within the Jewish world, you have people about 250 some years ago, there was a man whose name was Israel Baal Shem, or Yisrael Baal Shem, or the Baal Shem Tov, as he's known. And he came along to the world and began to teach and expose what we would call the mystical teachings of Judaism. It was always there, but he made it a mission to integrate that into common Jewish practice. There was a lot of opposition to this new kind of approach. And eventually, on this day, yesterday and today's day, the 19th and 20th of this Hebrew month, the founder of Chabad, who was the 3rd generation of the Hasidic movement, who had been arrested for his efforts on spreading these teachings and was slandered on by other people, to the Tsar, was liberated. And it was seen as a heavenly sign that this work needed to be expanded. His primary works is known as the Book of Tanya, Tanya. You can Google it online, go to chabad.org, look at the Book of Tanya, and it's a worthwhile. It's not a bedroom read. It's very profound, and many books have been written. A great scholar who passed away a couple of years ago, Rabbi Steinsaltz, wrote 3 or 4 books in English. It's called Opening the Tanya. But it's fascinating, and I think a lot of the ideas, even if they may be a little bit foreign, will resonate with you. But at the core of this Book of Tanya, which is a journey of understanding the self, and by understanding the self, understanding where our relationship with our higher power, with God, comes into play, it captures a very fundamental principle. And I got a text earlier this morning from an organization that is in the business of promoting the teaching of Tanya, and they had a video of a gentleman who comes. It would take too long to explain the nuance here, but comes from a community within the Jewish world, that the fact that these words were coming out of his mouth is miraculous. And he basically said that when I do something wrong, he was talking about himself, when I do something wrong, I realize that I don't have to beat myself up over it, that there's a part of me that's wired for doing, for engaging in those things. this is, and he learned that from the book of Tanya to kind of unpack what that means. So the book of Tanya, it's been called a tale of two souls. We each have two souls. We have what we call an animal soul, and we have a godly soul. What is the animal soul? The animal soul has a lot of different names in English. It's called the nervous system. It's called genetics. It's called cultural influences. It's called upbringing. But if we take this moment in time, this exact moment, and you think about your personality and your strengths and your weaknesses, and what brings you to this moment. You might have some anxiety about something that's going to go on today. You got to meet someone, you got to do something, you got a to-do list, or you may actually be completely blasé about what you have to do today. Like, whatever, it's all going to be great. It's going to be a fantastic day. Things are just going to flow. And or you might be really struggling right now with a relationship that's like just consuming you. Or you may just be like the most popular person around, right? So all of these different, and that list is infinite, right? But each of us are complex, and each of us have the way we show up in those relationships and those experiences and that worldview and all that stuff. Take a deep breath from what I'm about to say. It's got nothing to do with you. You didn't make that happen. That is all packaging that someone, in this case, our higher power, ultimately orchestrated and facilitated for us. So I didn't get to choose who I was going to be born to. I didn't get to choose what genetic makeup I would have. I didn't get to choose how my parents were going to raise me. And by the way, I didn't get to choose how I was going to respond to my parents when they raised me. I didn't get to choose what circumstances happened to me in childhood. I didn't get to choose which school to go to. I didn't get to choose who my friends were going to be, right? I didn't even get to choose, really, in a sense, the choices that I made as a child, because I had no self-awareness and I had no context to make other choices, right? And so on and so forth. How many things, if you think about what brought you here today, how many other things needed to happen in your world that you have absolutely no control over to bring you where you are today, and to have this complex makeup of a human being to create the circumstance for whatever is going on in your world right now, positive or negative. That's the animal soul. Now, if we look at that objectively, then the fact that I am struggling with anxiety or a relationship or an addiction, there's nothing to blame myself about. There's no shame in that, right? It's a reality. It's a circumstance. And by the way, the parallel of addiction being a disease, if we use the disease parallel, right? Why does somebody have cancer, right? And you're gonna tell me, well, they were exposed to secondhand smoke. I'm just not going to buy that, because there are plenty of other people that are exposed to secondhand smoke and don't get cancer. I'm not saying you should be exposed to secondhand smoke, but there's so many other factors that go into that you can't really blame the person. I'm not saying we don't have any culpability in life, but the reality is that there's so much that needs to happen to bring us to any given moment that's outside of our control. All of that is the animal soul. Now, the reason we want to be in the relationship, the reason that we have that anxiety, that we want to do different, we want to do better, we don't want to have the stresses, that's not coming from our animal soul, because our animal soul is wired for that stuff. That's coming from a different part of who we are. And that's what we call the godly soul. That's our higher consciousness. That higher consciousness says, no, relationships are important, and living selfless is of value, and making a difference in this world is of meaning. And don't be completely caught up in yourself, and don't be completely narcissistic and self-interest and so on. Now suddenly we're stuck in this tension. Now we got a playing field. Part of us is pulling us this way, and part of us is pulling us that way. King Solomon says that the spirit of man is to go up and the spirit of the animals to go down. So we have these two spirits living in us. The body, the animal soul, is pulling us down, and the godly soul is pulling us up, both literally and metaphorically, right? The godly soul is pushing us to living a higher life. The animal soul is pushing us to live a lower life. And by the way, the parallel between the reason we call it an animal soul is because animals do exactly what they're wired for. They don't have a godly soul. They have a divine energy, but they don't have a godly soul. They don't have a consciousness that says live higher. So are you going to blame the lion for tearing apart the gazelle? It's what lions are designed to do. And if you have a dog or a cat and that are trained, and then one day they decide to pee or poop on the carpet, you're going to get angry at them. You're going to kick them. You're going to beat them. They're an animal. So you train them, but they're still an animal, and they're still going to do what animals do. And if they tear up your couch, it's just expect that, right? You'd like to believe that you did a good job training them, but they're still an animal. There's some story of somebody wanted to prove this idea wrong, and I don't know if it's a real story, a metaphor, but they basically trained a bunch of cats to become waiters. So the cats, they come in all dressed with their bow ties and standing on two legs, walking with their trays, and the person there who's trying to be proved wrong says, "Oh wow, that's really impressive." He takes out a mouse and he drops it on the floor, and suddenly the cats all drop their platters and go after the mouse, right? So which, by the way, that parallel is also important, because we can train our animal. The animal soul, the animal component of who we are, can be trained. And that's a necessary part of the journey, is to train and, dare I say, surrender to the behaviors, to the actions that are necessary to live a more dignified and a more spiritual life. But that's not the end game, right? Obedience and control, discipline is important, but that's not the end game, because that's not an integrated life. It may be that, just like, just Maimonides, the great philosopher and codifier, says that when we begin educating a child, you do begin with punishment and reward. You give them a candy and there are consequences, right? But we don't want to be dealing with a 45-year-old person who's only going to do the right thing because they're getting a prize. That's not a healthy person. That's not an integrated person. Even though their animal is the same animal, it's still the fundamental properties of the animal component of the individual is just as much an animal as it was when the person was 5 years old. In other words, the cat is still a cat, even if it's trained, right? But we're not animals. We're human beings. So we have this capacity, and what makes us a human being is that not just that we eat sitting up and that we walk on two, but that we have this godly soul, that we have this higher consciousness, and that we're able to integrate the two together. So that's the end game. But sometimes, even when we find ways to integrate the two, we do have to fall back on the discipline and the obedience of the animal, because the reality is that we live in that tension. Right? We can be in a higher consciousness state for a period of time. We can do that when we're at meetings. We can do that when we're in prayer. But then we go back to work, and then we go back to those relationships, and then something triggers us, and the animal just fires up. And if we don't control it, yes. And how do we control it? So we try to control it with higher consciousness. And so we try to control it by saying, okay, let me take a deep breath and remember who I really am and what my real value is, and all of these other wonderful things. And sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. And when they don't work, you can't say, well, I'm sorry, the program's not working for me right now. When it's not working, you got to go back to the discipline, got to go back to the surrender, back to the obedience, do what you need to do. So that's the premise. Now, so if we go to the animal component, if you were to describe, I'm not asking anybody to actually do this, but you can do this for fun at home. Describe the type of animal you are. Okay, and I'll give you a classic biblical reference for this. So there's a commandment, there's a mitzvah in the Torah that when you see a lost object, you have an obligation to return it. Right? You find something that doesn't belong to you, you have an obligation to return it. So as a metaphor, this instruction is that when you see someone who's lost, right, they're spiritually lost, we have an obligation to help bring them back. Now, what does it mean to be spiritually lost? Taking away missionary kind of notions, just human compassion, emotion, notions of someone being lost. It means that they're not integrating body and soul. It means what is it? What's the expression? Will run riot. Did I say that correct? Self will run riot, right? So somebody being lost is self will run riot, which basically means that the animal is being an animal. It's gone crazy. It's gone crazy from a human perspective, but it's doing exactly what an animal is doing. But the reason why it's run riot is because it's not anchored in anything other than animal. And we are not animals. So when you see someone who's just completely lost it, right, they're completely disconnected, it's our job to try to bring them back, to try to help them get integrated. But the Torah gives 4 specific examples. An ox, a donkey, a sheep, and a garment. These are the 4 examples. Now, it doesn't mean exclusively those 4, but these 4 are articulated because they represent very common natures. Maybe we can categorize the human animal into 4 categories. What is an ox? An ox is powerful and aggressive. So any kind of aggression is likened to an ox. You can have a pit bull, which also falls into that category. Or you might say, well, I don't want to offend any dog lovers here. Dogs have a much more aggressive nature than maybe cats, although some will argue cats also have I'm dialing that one back. Okay, that's an ox. Then a donkey. A donkey is stubborn. And again, stubbornness has all kinds of manifestations, but a donkey is stubborn. It actually says, in addition, it says that a donkey is cold. It says that donkeys, the Talmud says that in the heat of summer, a donkey shivers, they're cold. But there's a coldness that a donkey has. And sometimes people can be overly cold to things that are important and that they should be passionate about. Then you have a sheep. A sheep is actually a really, really difficult animal, because what is the qualification? What is the quality of a sheep? What comes to mind?
Followers,
obedience, right? So the problem with being a follower is when you're a follower, as the classic imagery of a sheep, you have no personality. I'll go wherever you tell me to go. You want me to party? I'll go party. You want me to go to synagogue? I'll go to synagogue. You want me to go to school? I'll go to school. It's like, hello, are you alive? Is there anybody in there? I'm just following whatever. So if you're just a follower, then where's you? Where's your personality? How do you get yourself anchored if you're like, whatever you want me to do, I'll do? It's like, so somebody shows up, and I'm sure you've experienced this. Somebody says, okay, I need help. I say, well, just show up to meetings. And they do over and over again, but there's no fire in there. So it's a dry drunk. I mean, essentially they're doing what they're supposed to do, but they're not alive. It's not substantive. It's not anchored. And then the clothing is also complex, because clothing can be changed. The idea of clothing is that I can be, not that I'm going to be a follower, but I can put on whoever you want me to be, or whoever I want to be, right? I can put on a mask. I can pretend to be whatever I need to be to navigate whatever it is I want to navigate. So these are as a metaphor for different types of animals that we may possess. But let's what's the common denominator? The common denominator is that an animal has propulsion, self-propulsion. There's an energy there. There's a drive. Even if that drive is a quiet and passive drive, but there's a force there that's just moving forward, that's driving forward. So in steps 3, we made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood him. Now we need to take action. And that action has to be addressing that underlying propulsion. How do we harness that propulsion? How do we take that propulsion and bring it to where it needs to go? So, and by the way, the reason we don't let God in is because we know that we have to surrender that propulsion, right? If I'm on it's oftentimes very self-sabotaging, right? I want what I want, and I'm actually not going to open the door to a relationship with God, because if I do, then that means I have to surrender to that, and then I have to give up some of the me. at least in my perception. So after we've come to this awareness and this surrender, immediately action is necessary. And I know that that's a principle across the board. Take the next step. What's the next step, right? And the next step is always some kind of action. It's not a good feeling. It's not a good thought process. It's an action. What does that look like in actuality? Because the animal needs to be harnessed. And in that act of harnessing it, we're beginning the integration. Does this make sense? Does it resonate?
Did I miss, what is a garnet? Garment? Garment?
Clothing.
Oh, related to
Yeah,
the sheep.
sorry.
Got it. Okay.
So I want to share one more idea on this step. One of the resentments that people can have, and we know that in addiction, resentments are the killer. It's the worst. One of the resentments, which is a self-pitying, is why do I need to have this kind of animal, right? Why did I end up with this kind of animal who's got these drives and these interests and so on? So there's a positive twist. And again, I think it's critical to embrace this idea as you begin a fourth step, which is that where does life, and this is going to be, I'm going to say this from a spiritual standpoint, almost a religious standpoint. The objective is to make the world a more godly world. Right? That's the objective of existence. We're not just we're not insignificant, for starters, right? Each of us is a unique creation. And if you don't believe that, you're on the wrong train, because life is much more fun to just do whatever you want. But we're not here just to have fun. We're here to live a meaningful and purposeful life. And by the way, you can't help it anyway, because you've got this godly consciousness. It's going to always drive you to, you can't escape it, right? You say, "Oh, I'm just going to indulge endlessly in my own self-interest." Well, good luck on that. I'm not just talking about because it doesn't work in the real world, but also inside of yourself. There is a part of you that will never let you just be that way. Try to be cold, okay? Just good luck with that. Just try to be indifferent. But from a fundamental standpoint, we're not here to just pass through 70, 80, 100 years and just live, eat, drink, and be merry, right? We're here to make a difference, and not just for ourselves, but existentially for all of humanity, for all of creation, all of existence. So one of the things I find interesting, really anybody who's really worked a program of recovery is grateful that they have the addiction, and they have recovery, which I've always found, I'm in awe of that, because I'm a little bit still narcissistic and self-interested. And my conversation with God is sometimes often, why me? Why did you set me up with this set of circumstances, right? And yes, there are things in my life where I can look at and say, I see how that experience has shaped me and has shaped my world. But if you ask me, would I trade it in and not have the benefit and not have the pain? I might say yes. I would have to really think about that, but I might say yes. I'm not sold on, I'll give you a very raw example. My mother died when I was 12, and it's absolutely shaped the person that I am in so many ways. But I'm not sure if you asked me if you would trade it out and for me to have a more simple life, less influential, if I would not have it otherwise. I'm not so sure I would say no. But I don't move, in other words, I don't move away from the resentment for me. And I understand that the journey is different. I don't move away from that kind of question and resentment by saying, oh, I'm so grateful that that happened to me. I move away from that resentment by recognizing that what's happened to me is by God's design. So this is my purpose on this earth. So in that sense, I'm grateful that it happened because it's helping me fulfill my purpose. But on a deep emotional level, I can't say that I'm sold on that. Okay, but having said that, really to the point, so recognizing that what's happened to me is by the divine design for me to live my life's purpose, which is to bring godliness and to bring goodness into the world and to create that integration. The journey, the struggle, gives us access to that in a way that nothing else does. What do I mean by that? If you're living an easy road life, you don't interact with too many people, you don't interact with too many things, you don't interact with too many experiences, right? I mean, I'll give you a parallel concept from Tanya. He talks about two types of love. He talks about love like fire and love like water. So he's talking about a relationship with God, but the human parallel itself is very obvious. You have people who have a relationship that's love like water. What does it mean, love like water? It just flows. Easy street, and everybody gets along, everything's nice and sweet. And then you have love like fire, right? Love like fire is very contentious. You're butting heads, you're arguing. But you know what you also do? You love like mad. You love deeply. You love in a way that water will never love. So it's a trade-off. So living a life that's a love like fire gives you access to parts of yourself and parts of the one you're in a relationship with that you would never have otherwise. So using that parallel in terms of living an easy street life, your capacity and ability to impact yourself and the world is only going to be so much. But when you start bumping up against things within yourself, character flaws, character defects, and you have to look at them and you have to work with them and you have to navigate them and you have to surrender to a higher power, you have to surrender to God, and then you have to incorporate that into your practice, into your day-to-day life. Suddenly those flaws become permeated, they become integrated with spirituality, holiness, godliness, higher power, and suddenly you're creating transformation in a way that the person next to you can't possibly do. Not that it's about the other person, but suddenly. So when we start making an inventory and we start looking at these things, these character defects, these moral failings and so on and so forth, not moral failings, the character flaws and character defects, and we start looking at them and we start analyzing them, and we say, oh, I'm being given an opportunity here. I'm being given an opportunity because of these very challenges to really fulfill the purpose of creating integration in this world in a way that I would never be able to otherwise. So that's very, very surface layer of step 4. Any questions or comments on this?
I love that so much because it's like what I hear a lot, especially like in the love life world. For me, I've always loved like fire, not just with partners, but with life in general. Some say in the sun, sign, or the moon, whatever. But like everyone's always like, just go with the flow. Why can't you just go with the flow? I'm like, I could, but I thrive on excitement. And like without that, like, sure, things would be peaceful.
But you wouldn't be you.
Exactly. And that could also be said, on topic with my recovery and my alcoholism and addiction. For a while, I was stuck in that really heated fire, and I didn't have the balance. And so now that I'm in recovery and doing all of the program and meeting people and putting myself out there, my fire is still hot, but it's balanced. And
It's
like,
channeled.
yeah, yeah. I've gotten rid of the wind that keeps like putting it out of control. So like I can still enjoy things with that passion and fire, but without like burning the world down with me.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Tell me your name, please.
Michelle.
Michelle.
Sorry.
Okay. I'm not taking attendance today. Okay, wonderful. Anybody else want to make a comment? Okay. So what we did in step 4 is we recognized, we made this inventory of what those character defects are. Now we do have to take responsibility for where our character defects have showed up in external manifestation and affected our moral behaviors, people in around us, things around us, right? We have to take responsibility for that, which is where the admission to God, to ourselves, and to another human being, the exact nature of our wrongs, begins to take this out of the dark and bring it out into the open. So I want to introduce again, and it's just very fortuitous and divine providence that we're doing this on this special day, where the book of Tanya is so dominant in the practice of Chabad. I'm going to give you three terms, and you're welcome to write it down. It might be helpful to keep focus on it. So we have what's known as a tzaddik, a righteous individual. We have I'll just give you the English, let's call it the intermediary, or the middle, or we might even say the ordinary. And then we have the wicked.
Would anyone like a notepad? I do have a pile of them here. I'll just put them here.
What's the first one? The Hebrew term tzaddik, or is that like a?
Tzaddik.
Oh.
Tzaddik. Tzaddik. Tzaddik.
Okay.
That's okay. There's probably a million ways to write it.
Righteous.
Righteous, yep. The middle one, if you want to write the Hebrew, it's Benoni, which is spelled B. One of the ways to spell it anyway is Beinoni. And the third one is called a Rasha, Rasha, which translates as wicked. So these three terms are we're going to present them as they are in their truest stage. So the tzaddik has no negative impulse. Do you know anybody like that?
Yeah.
You do? There are the Midrash, which is a compendium of commentary on the Torah, has a passage that says that God saw that the righteous were few, and he spread them throughout the generations. So if you've met one, you're very fortunate, because they are not commonplace. You want to say something?
Oh, so you just mean it. When I hear righteous, I feel like righteous means self-righteous, but I guess it's a good thing.
Yeah, no. So in this context, righteous is a good thing. It's someone who does not have negative impulse. Okay. On the opposite extreme, you have one who has negative impulse and acts on it. So the Russia, the wicked, is a person who does what their negative impulse. That when the negative impulse expresses itself, they go and do whatever that negative impulse wants them to do. And then you have the Benoni, the middle person, which is what Rabbi Schusterman, the author of Tanya, says is the goal and the objective for humans, is to arrive to this middle level, which is that you cannot eliminate your negative impulse, but you can control your negative impulse.
So could you diagnose the righteous as codependent and the wicked as the sociopath kind of?
I would say it the other way around.
Okay.
So first of all, I'm more comfortable to say that the sociopath is wicked.
Did I not say it right like that? Okay, that's what I meant.
No, in other words, not everybody who is wicked is a sociopath.
Okay.
In other words, because on a very technical level, probably most of us around this table fall into that category. Okay. No. That's exactly the distinction I'm making. We fall into the technical category of wicked in this context. Not that you're a bad person, but that we do give in to negative impulse. So we may not always give into negative impulse. We hopefully mostly don't give into negative impulse. But if the question is who's in control? Is it the animal or is it the godly soul? Now, just because the godly soul is going to be in control, it doesn't mean that your animal goes away. That's the tzaddik. The righteous person doesn't have the drive of the animal soul. His or her animal is so aligned that there is no negative impulse. Totally and absolutely dedicated to the cause of the godly soul. How? That's a very lofty place to be, and it's not something you can attain on your own. That's why it's actually a gift when there's a passage in Job where Job is having this conversation with God, and he says to God, "You have created righteous and you've created wicked." And it begs the question: if God created righteous and God created wicked, then what are we doing here? We're just a bunch of puppets. And Rabbi Schusterman understands that passage not to be a commentary on all of us, but to be a commentary on those that are destined to be able to eradicate the negative impulse. But that's not something you can achieve. You can't sign up for that. You can only live your life. I'll give this to you in a really practical way, because let me finish the thought and I'll come back to that. So where do we live? Where do we strive? We strive to achieve this level of Benoni, this middle level, where we recognize that we have negative impulse, but that we don't have to give into it. And it's a hard place to live. It's a hard place to embrace. I would put it this way: the more consciousness you have of self and the more understanding you have of self, in a certain sense, it becomes more difficult to live. On the other hand, it becomes easier to live, right? In other words, the more you understand of what's really going on inside of you, the more you actually have to engage with it, right? Ignorance is bliss in a sense, but the more you understand who you are and what's moving you, you have to come to terms with the fact that you might always have this negative impulse. It's much easier to be in this la-la land where you say, "Oh, I'm going to get in control of that, no problem," right? That's why so many people engage in the addiction, because it's a fantasy. Oh, I'm good with that. No, you're not. You're always going to have this negative impulse, and you're always going to have to engage in the control of that negative impulse. That's a hard place to live, but that's what it means to be alive. And with addiction, the obsession is letting the obsession go, or being relieved of the obsession, is really kind of the first gift. Once you've passed that stage of letting go of the obsession, the negative impulse doesn't go away. I was just listening to, maybe somebody mentioned it at the last class, something about, or it was Rabbi Jacobson, they said that something goes away, but not the temptation. Forgetting what it was, something, not the, maybe something like that.
The obsession?
Yeah, maybe the
But-
obsession goes away, but the temptation is always there. I used to smoke. I don't walk around every day. So I need a cigarette now. When can I get a cigarette? But if there was nothing wrong with smoking and nobody in my life minded, I'd smoke a cigarette right now. Now, not everybody, some people actually get rid of the desire, right? Not me. I still have that inner, again, it's not an active struggle. I have no obsession for it whatsoever. I don't even have an urge for it unless I'm walking by somebody who's smoking and whatever comes with that, right? So the temptation is always there. But being alive is about recognizing that temptation is there, but that I am in control of not giving into that temptation. Now, it's important to recognize that where our capacity for control is. Because if we are trying to control something we can't control, then the frustration is there and the resentment is there. So what can we control? So I'll give you this as again, fundamental principles from the book of Tanya. Our self expresses itself. Where is the I, right? The I is the soul. The I consciousness is the soul. So where does your soul express itself? Give me an example of where your soul expresses itself. It's not a good or bad example. I think wants belong more to, on some level they do. Okay, so where do those wants express themselves?
Like say for example, I want to go travel the world. That in turn creates my fuel and fire to want to work hard and make money so I can make that.
So where does the want express itself? What you just said, and give me the end result. Where is it actually manifesting itself? In the action, right? So the first place soul expresses itself, actually the last place, is in action. But before you get to action, where else does it express itself? Before you go traveling, you got to go make the money. So you're already engaged in a thought, right? So the first place it goes is the thought. So that's one. We call them garments of the soul, right? So the soul expresses itself through thinking, thought. The second place it expresses itself is in. Try me on. That's the third place. One in between, something in between.
Like love and relationships? Like
No,
we use
expression.
Okay.
Expression. Give me expression.
Hobbies?
That's action.
Okay.
Very good. Speech. No, talking. Speech. Speech. So every expression of the soul will have. You can't express the soul in the body except through one of these three things: thought, speech, or action. Thought, speech, and action. And by the way, those are the only things you have control over. The only things you have control over is what you think, not to think. You can never turn your mind off, but you can choose what to think about. You can choose what to speak or not to speak, and you can choose to act or not to act, and how to act. So regardless of who you are, who your animal is, and what your animal is wired for, we always have the capacity to direct our thoughts, our speech, and our action to a higher purpose, to our higher power, to our higher identity.
So that in turn is where the challenge is. That's where the pause comes in.
And what does that do in that pause? What are you doing in the context of what we just said here?
Thinking.
You're thinking, and you're recognizing, right? If we're at this middle level, this Beinoni level, what we're recognizing is I can't help the fact that I have the urge. I can't help the fact that that person just triggered me and I want to cuss at them. I can't help that. That's my wiring. But I absolutely can control my thinking not to nurture that thought. And I absolutely can control my mouth not to utter those words. So don't beat yourself up that you're triggered, because as we said earlier, that's your wiring. That's not your fault. That's all part of actually, it's all part of the setup, right? It's all part of the master plan. Because in this act of self-control, which is ultimately an act of surrender, right? That's where the pause comes in, right? It's the act of surrender. What are you surrendering? You're surrendering the fact, you're surrendering two things. Number one, that God is in control, meaning that this is his plan, number one. And you're surrendering that how you are showing up is not in your control. In other words, the fact that you are triggered by this is not in your control. So what is in your control? What you do next. What you're going to think, what you're going to speak, and what you're going to do.
That reminds me of what we talked about on the last session, where it was instead of why, what, flip it to what, like instead of why did this happen to me, or, you know, why does everything keep going wrong today, instead of what am I going to do about it?
Yeah.
It's so interesting how like, well, this is just where my head's going. I'm very all over the place.
All good.
So I've been reading a lot of different cultures, Buddhism, Christianity, like Judaism, obvious. It's my core, but they're all so similar. Like at the core, like forget about like the sub branches and subgenres of the religions and the churches or whatever. It all comes down to that. God, do for others, be free of yourself. It's so cool.
Beautiful. Beautiful. So let's bring together with that foundation, step 5 and step 6. So in step 5, we admitted to God, to ourselves, and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs. And in step 6, we're entirely ready to have God remove all these defects of character. So in the act of admitting, I had a very interesting conversation about this a couple of years ago with Rabbi Schusterman, the author of God of Our Understanding. Because when I did this class the first time, my objective was to show, kind of to your point, that these are universal principles, but my specifically agenda was to show that these are Jewish principles that may also be other principles, but Jews shouldn't be afraid of the 12 steps because they're deeply rooted in our teachings. And when I got to this step, I said, that sounds like, Catholic confession. Mm-hmm. So he said, it's not about the confession. It's about the admission to God and to ourselves about what it is. It's getting it out of the dark. Mm-hmm. The other person is just a necessary part of it. It's not about the other person. In other words, and I not that I'm a student at all of Catholicism, but I have to suspect that that's fundamentally what it is as well, even though maybe along the way it's gotten perverted. But it's not about you knowing my secrets. Mm-hmm. It's not what it's about. It's that I can't keep my secrets inside of me. I need to bring them to light. But you want to say something?
Yeah, it's just interesting. I was having this discussion with my sponsor yesterday, and we were just talking about how, like, if you don't say it out loud to someone else, it's like fungus. It's just going to grow and continue to grow in the dark.
Yeah. So the admission is, in a certain sense, what it's actually doing is when we had the symposium a few weeks back, I think it was Smitty who said something that really, really struck me. There's this notion, you see the kids, a lot of the kids do it today. They're something's, they're involved in something and they do something wrong, and and they say, that's my ADD, right? That's my ADD kicking in. I don't mean any offense, but you actually just said it before, right? So we say that. And sometimes it's actually true they have ADD. A lot of people have no ADD diagnosis, but they say it anyway. Or they say they do something wrong and they say, oh, that's my bad. Or they say, what does my bad mean? And it's another way of saying, well, it's not actually saying my fault. It's not intended to be that. It's actually a shirking of taking responsibility.
Apology.
It's instead of saying, I'm sorry that I did that, right? It's blaming. It's my bad. It's my ADD. Like, I don't really own this problem. It's something else affecting me, right? So if we translate that down to what's going on here, if this animal, right, this animal soul, this animal consciousness is wired with that stuff, own it. Nothing wrong with owning it. It's only a problem to own it if we have shame about it. And the only reason you have shame about it is if you think that you are the cause for having those shortcomings. But if we expose it for what it is, which is what we did in the fourth step, and we say, wait, these are not my doings. This is how God programmed me. These are the circumstances that God put me into the world. And these are the circumstances. Again, I'm not shirking responsibility, but I'm also identifying that my flaws are not a bug. They're a feature. That's what basically Smitty said. He said, I always saw my awkwardness, he was speaking, as something broken about me. And I realize it's part of the design, right? It's part of the design that I have these weaknesses, that I have these flaws. And as we said, because that's what makes me me. So if I can embrace that, and in that recognize that, yes, those things have created the setting where I, unfortunately, have not maintained control of it. But I also didn't have the awareness that I have now. So that's also part of the design. But I do have the awareness now. And therefore, I can take responsibility for what I did because I have no shame around it. I have responsibility around it, but I don't have shame around it. And I could also resolve moving forward, now that I have this awareness, to act differently. When I can do that, so when I do that with another person, I'm actually, so when I do it with myself, I admit to self, I am articulating for myself what I'd like to believe about myself. When I admit to God, I'm engaging God in that conversation. But I don't see God. I'm believing in God. But when I do it with another person, I'm actually saying, hey, I have these flaws. And I've used these flaws, I've given into these flaws to harm that person, to do that thing, and so on and so forth. And I'm recognizing that these flaws are part of my design, and I'm taking responsibility for my lack of control around them. And now that I've gotten that out, I don't have to carry any shame around it. And I can choose to live differently. Which is, in step 6, we're entirely ready to have God remove all these defects of character. So again, when I started this journey, I had a problem with this step. I'm not going to get rid of these defects of character. So what is this step really all about? But if you look at the words, it says we're entirely ready to have God. It's about the readiness. It means I'm not owning them. I'm not owning them in a sense like I'm subservient to them. I'm ready to have God remove them. I'm ready to do what I need to do. And by the way, let's break down some of the nature of those 3 types of people: the tzaddik, the Beinoni, the rasha, the righteous, the ordinary, and the wicked. There are things in our lives, maybe not the big things, but there are small things in our lives that we may have classified those behaviors at some point in our life as wicked behaviors, meaning that we we were completely subservient to them. We let those behaviors control us. And in other words, I'm not talking about necessarily the addiction, because the addiction, the temptation for the addiction may still be very prevalent. But I'm talking about other character flaws, other behaviors, other triggers, right? That we may have acted on in the past. So when they came at us, when the thing, the person, the circumstance triggered, so when they did whatever it is, it triggered. So first we had the trigger, we had the response, and then we had the reaction. We took the action as a result of that. So that person said something to me and it triggered me, and I responded back. Not a good process. But because I have that awareness, and I've worked with my therapist, and I've contemplated, and whatever else the journey is, I don't have that trigger anymore. Now, again, there's no guarantee, but on a spectrum of the things that most trigger us and the things that least trigger us, I'm sure all of us can look back in our lives and say, you know, that thing just doesn't bother me anymore. Now, where did it go? Right? Can you identify something in your life, maybe something small that doesn't trigger you anymore, that may have once upon a time? Some heads nodding, some are curious. Okay. Again, it doesn't have to be a big thing. It could be you come into your office and your desk is a mess because somebody left something on it, and you would get hot under the collar and shoot your mouth off. And now you come in and your thought is, oh, they must have rushed out of the office. Like, I don't have to, the blood pressure doesn't have to rise at all, right? You know, what's changed? Well, you've done your work, but God has removed that particular defect of character from you. In other words, that trigger has been removed. Now you've done your work, so you've helped, but you've also done your work in other areas, and it hasn't worked, right? You've tried to change your perspective about certain things, and you've really worked hard at it, and you've worked with your therapist, and you've retold your story, and so on and so forth, but it still happens. Maybe a little softer, maybe not as intensely, but it's still, something still triggers you. Okay. The point is that there's no guarantee of the inner change, but it's the fundamental understanding of what is going on inside of us, and having brought that into the light in step 5, that allows for us in step 6 to say, I am open to the change. And again, I think that the fact is that on some level, all of us have things that have been removed from us. Again, they may not be that dramatic. And I don't think the objective anyway, again, in this step is about, it's not about the result. It's not about the result in terms of character defects. It's not about achieving perfection. It's about excellence. It's about going through the same thing over and over again, and having the awareness over and over again, and getting better at minimizing the intensity of the trigger, of the response inside of ourselves, definitely on the outside of ourselves, but even inside of ourselves, taking it down a degree or two. And these thought processes, from recognizing these core principles, recognizing that we are made up of animal soul and godly soul, recognizing that everything that's happened in our lives is all a divine structure for us to fulfill our purpose, understanding that what we have control over is thought, speech, and action, understanding that we can receive a gift of character defects being removed, and that if we do what we need to do, some of the intensity of that will be minimized. If that's the process we follow day in, day out, which is really fundamentally what we mean when we say working the program, right? Then we're actually living, we're alive, and we're living towards our purpose on this earth.
The other human being aspect. So when you pick a sponsor, it's really someone who has what you want spiritually, not materialistically. And so like when I walked through my fifth step, you know, it was like if it had just been between me and God, then I would have missed out on her perspective on things, because it is coming from a place of her having been on a spiritual journey longer than me, I guess, from a time perspective, but also just, you know, maybe other experiences. And so it really did, like when you were talking about sort of changing the way that our initial reaction is to things, it doesn't mean that the thought of smoking a cigarette doesn't come in mind. It's just maybe the pursuit of whatever I'm gonna do next, like, or the anger maybe flying out. It doesn't have to be the same. It's like turning the volume down on things that were so loud and so all consuming and powerful, and when things are so all consuming and loud like that, I am much more likely to give in to every single animalistic urge that comes by, you know, to like pour something on it to turn that noise down, or take a pill, or to, you know. And so it really, the fifth step really was very transformative for me, because it was like, first of all, the best therapy I'd ever gotten. First of all, because we're being really honest, when I pay for therapy, I'm typically painting a picture that I'm a victim, and like therapist has not even a chance to help me. But like in the context of recovery, it's like, it really does help to turn the volume down on things, so life doesn't have to be so intense and spiky, and even for those resentments, you know, one thing, I don't know if it's because women tend to have had certain things happen in life that maybe more often than men, but actually I think that's probably not totally the case. But sometimes there are things that happen, like with your mother passing away at 12, like that is, I mean, that happened, like that wasn't anything that you had anything to do with. You know, if that was on your fourth step of being resentful, that you know, why was your mother taking from you at age, like, so one thing that I talk to my sponsees about is sometimes there are gonna be things on your fourth step that you really were the victim, like you had absolutely no hand in that series of events that led up to that thing that happened that you're so angry about. But it's like, how have we let that drive us in a negative way? Like those negative character defects to just get really super dominant, I guess, and show up too much as a result of that. Like yeah, so just it all kind of connects to some things that you've talked about. So
Great,
really
great.
helpful.
Like,
Thank
are
you.
Holding it with you, it's making you angry, or are you helping someone else that may have gone through that?
Right, like letting it just basically be in the driver's seat, causing
Right.
me to do all these self-destructive things, and well, not just self-destructive, but hurting people around me, and yeah.
Like resentment's blocked because I'm let it pursue it.
Yeah.
Don't give your power up. You know, we have a lot of talk about power today, right? You know, what is your real power? It's inside of yourself. It's this notion that you might have been a victim of something, of someone that was terrible, but by letting the anger around it dominate your behavior, you've become a victim again. Instead of saying what they did was wrong, they hurt me, but I am in control of how I'm going to respond to that. And again, it doesn't take away your humanity, because it's painful. And again, I think the point here is to embrace that, embrace the reality that things have happened to us, not to deny them. Things have happened to us that have been hurtful, but they are part of a master plan. And by the way, maybe turn the video off, but we don't have to let God off the hook either. in terms of our relationship with God, saying, I don't understand why you allowed for this to happen. But I'm not going to let that either prevent me, because of my limited capacity to comprehend God. I'm not going to let that either prevent me from being able to live fully in service. Right? That's a hard place to get to, but that's the surrender we need to get to. We can't, if you can resolve it with faith, that you believe that God is good and that everything is good for you and you can actually integrate that, that's great. If you can only, when I say you can resolve that with faith, means that you have the capacity to integrate it. If you don't have the capacity to integrate it, but you understand it intellectually and you surrender to that belief, you can take back your power. I think we're going to stop here. I mean, we'll take more comments. I don't think I'm going to go on to the next step. We can do that. We'll do that next time we get together.
I want to say, I have talked about this before in meetings. I'm that person that I get combative, right? Like we all have that inner fight. I fight in AA meetings. I bring up how, like, I think it's so interesting, the use of the word control. We talk about how we have no control over anything, but we can control ourselves. I like when you said, what can we direct? And then I brought up mental illness earlier because I think it's so interesting. It's just so common that we hide behind the diagnoses. We use it as an excuse, but there is that question of, when is a person just so sick they're blind, and then how do they wake up to the notion that they can be aware and stop judging? And then my last thing that I think about a lot, but I haven't really thought it through entirely, but how do it's so interesting how people assign moral value to certain things, but really we kind of have to stop judging what is right from wrong, because certain things are just morally neutral. And I feel like that's something that is misconstrued a lot in the rooms. Like people just keep judging their past and what they've done, when really I feel like the freedom that you find is within releasing the judgment and rather just saying, this is what happened, this is what I'm doing now. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I hear you. I think that there's, I like the word control because I think it doesn't create any space for excusing. And if we have the right balance of self-compassion, I don't think control takes away from the self-compassion that we need to have and the honest inventory of who we are. Yes, I have this character flaw. Yes, this thing happened to me. Yes, that person did something wrong. Yes, I am a victim to that. Yes, 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 yes. And I still have control over how I'm going to choose to respond in the space of thought, speech, and action. I'm still in control of that. Talk about mental illness. I'm reading this book now. It's called The Genius of Israel. It's a brand new book that came out, just very fortuitous that it came out right now. And one of the things that's really fascinating in general about Israeli society, and Israeli culture, but emphasized in this book is how, in the Western world, for the most part, the people that break out of the mold are always like, wow, so amazing that they've broken out of the mold. In Israel, it's commonplace to the culture there. So one of the interesting things that they've experienced is that when you have a young person, army service is compulsory in Israel. So you have a young person who has autism, when a few weeks before I think they go into the service at 18, a few weeks before their birthday, they already have a diagnosis. It's documented somewhere that they have autism. They get a notice that because of your diagnosis, you're not welcome in the Army, because the Army needs people who are not autistic. And there was a young man who was autistic and said, that's not right. We have something to contribute. And began to push the envelope. And together with some general there, they discovered that people with autism have a gift that other people don't have. And that is they have the capacity to stay laser-like focused and pay attention to details that other people can't, that regular normal people can't do. Neurotypical, thank you. That's a better word. Can't. And what they did was they started putting them into units that study satellite imagery and study maps. And they love doing it because that's what they're wired for. And they're able to feed back information that neurotypical people can't do. And it's changed the nature of how the Army looks at people with autism. And then what's ended up happening from there is that in the work sector, which in the United States, less than 25% of people with autism are employed because people won't hire them. It's changed the nature in Israel, how they look at people with autism. Where can we find work for them in ways that we couldn't otherwise? So what you have is looking at let's quote unquote, a defect. I don't mean that in a judgmental way, but it's a defect because it's not neurotypical, and saying, okay, that's a reality. How do we turn that into an asset instead of a liability? So looking at ourselves and saying, oh, I've got this diagnosis, I got that diagnosis. Well, okay, well, I'm broken. I have a liability. And because I have that liability, well, I'm just going to sit at home and eat potato chips and watch TV. Or we can say, no, I have this diagnosis, and it's part of the design. It's not a flaw. It's not a bug. It's part of the design. Now, as soon as I say that, I've taken my power back. And now I can ask the question, what am I going to do with this? How am I going to live my life? How am I not going to be the victim and have to surrender to my temptations and my desires and my addiction? Because I don't have to surrender to that. Well, do I have a different challenge than the person next to me? Absolutely. But they have a different challenge than the person next to them. And each of us, and I'm not on your journey, I'm on my journey. I've got to live my character, my features, my brokennesses that are my features, not yours. You got to live yours, I got to live mine. You can't possibly take mine, I can't possibly take yours. But if I embrace mine, and I don't judge it, but I embrace it, it's part of the design, then I'm able to actually begin to live and know where my control is and where it isn't. So I think even the emphasis on using that strong word of control is actually an act of surrender. And it actually creates more responsibility, not less responsibility. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
And I think it leads perfectly into 8 and 9 that we'll talk about next, because I'm just thinking about in step 9, you're going to be making amends for some things that are really bad, that I've done, and I still burst out in tears every once in a while, especially around the holidays, when I think about how absent I was, for my family. But it's like, everything you're talking about, I think, just leads perfectly to 8 and 9, because it's like, okay, yes. And one thing my sponsor said when we were walking through is, the 5 and of course catering for amends is like, you were doing the best that you could do with that set of circumstances, with the wiring, with all of everything that you just described. You were doing the best, and oh, by the way, so were those people that harmed you. They were doing the best that they could do. So now, taking the judgment off of it, and then what do we do about it? So the other thing that you said too is before you had this awareness, well, now we have it. So there's a responsibility.
Right.
Yeah. So I think
You can't come back in a year and give an excuse for your awareness today,
yes,
because you have that awareness now.
yes.
Mhm.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
a responsibility.
Wonderful. All right.